Alright, so we've talked about Walt's manipulation abilities before, how he's basically a master at getting inside people's heads and bending them to his will. But what's interesting is thinking about how Walt would do against the Better Call Saul characters. Like, could Walt manipulate Jimmy McGill? Could he handle someone like Lalo Salamanca? Would Gus Fring fall for any of Walt's tricks? We're gonna go through the major Better Call Saul characters and figure out if Walt could manipulate them or if they'd see right through his bullshit. And this gets interesting because some of these people are way more experienced in the criminal world than Walt ever was. Some of them have been playing manipulation games since before Walt even thought about cooking meth with Jimmy McGill or Saul Goodman. Yes, Walt could manipulate him. Starting with Jimmy, and yeah, Walt could absolutely manipulate him. In fact, we basically see this happen in Breaking Bad. Now, Jimmy is himself a master manipulator. The guy's a con artist. He's been running scams since he was a kid. Slippin' Jimmy knows every trick in the book when it comes to lying and manipulating people for personal gain. But here's Jimmy's weakness. Jimmy desperately wants to be seen as legitimate and respected. Underneath all the scams and the Saul Goodman persona, there's still this part of Jimmy that wants people to take him seriously as a lawyer, and as a person, Walt would exploit that immediately. Walt's got this way of making people feel valued when he needs them. He'd treat Jimmy like a trusted advisor, like a crucial part of the operation. He'd ask Jimmy's opinion on things and actually listen, or at least pretend to. And Jimmy would eat that up because he's not used to being treated with genuine respect by people. Most of Walt's crew treats Saul like a joke. They use his services, but they don't respect him. Walt could differentiate himself by showing Jimmy that respect, even if it's fake. Plus, Walt's good at using fear mixed with that respect. He'd make sure Jimmy understood that Walt is dangerous, but he'd do it in a way that makes Jimmy feel protected rather than threatened. Like, you're with me, you're safe, but don't cross me. The other thing is, Jimmy's got this weakness for lost causes and underdogs. At least the Jimmy side of him does. Walt's excellent at playing the underdog when it suits him. I'm just a high school teacher trying to provide for my family. Jimmy would have sympathy for that narrative. In Breaking Bad, we see Saul is kind of terrified of Walt but also weirdly loyal. That's successful manipulation. Walt's gotten Saul to stick around and keep helping even when it's clearly dangerous because Walt's played on Saul's need for respect and his fear at the same time. So yeah, Walt could manipulate Jimmy, not easily because Jimmy's smart and experienced, but Walt's got the emotional intelligence to find Jimmy's buttons and push them. Kim is trickier, but I think Walt could manipulate her, at least initially. Kim is smart, competent, and way more ethical than most people in the Breaking Bad universe. She's got strong moral principles, and she's not afraid to stand up to people. Those qualities would make her resistant to Walt's usual tactics, but Kim's got vulnerabilities that Walt could exploit. The main one is her need to help people who are struggling, especially people she sees potential in. Kim has this pattern of trying to save people, whether it's Jimmy or her pro bono clients. She wants to believe she can help people become better versions of themselves. Walt is excellent at positioning himself as someone who needs help and guidance. He'd come to Kim with this story about being desperate, about needing to provide for his family, about being in over his head. And Kim, seeing this obviously intelligent person who's made bad choices, might think she could guide him toward better decisions. Walt would also respect Kim's intelligence in a way he doesn't respect a lot of people. Not genuinely, but he'd perform that respect really well. He'd ask her advice, defer to her judgment on legal matters, make her feel like a valued partner rather than just hired help. The thing that would eventually break Walt's manipulation of Kim is that Kim is really good at seeing through people's bullshit. It might take her a while, but she'd eventually clock what Walt is. She'd see that his family man routine is partly performance, that his desperation is mixed with ego and pride. And once Kim sees that, she's out. Kim's not Jesse, who can be manipulated back after figuring things out. Once a Kim decides someone is bad for her, she cuts them off. We see this with some of her clients and eventually even with Jimmy to some extent. So Walt could manipulate Kim in the short term, especially if he met her early in his Heisenberg journey when he was still performing the good man in a bad situation role convincingly. But long term, Kim's too perceptive and too principled to stay under Walt's control. Gustavo Fring. No, Walt couldn't manipulate him. Gus is a hard no. Walt could not manipulate Gus, and honestly, we see this in Breaking Bad. Gus is operating on a completely different level than almost everyone else in these shows. The man built a drug empire while maintaining a perfect cover as a legitimate businessman. He's patient, strategic, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. He's been playing the long game for decades. Walt tries to manipulate Gus throughout their relationship, and it basically never works. Gus sees through Walt's tactics almost immediately. When Walt tries to make himself seem indispensable, Gus just starts training Gale to replace him. When Walt tries to play on Gus's emotions or appeal to his business sense, Gus remains completely unmoved. The fundamental problem is that Gus is better at strategic thinking than Walt is. Gus thinks longer term, plans more carefully, and doesn't let ego or emotion cloud his judgment. The way Walt does Walt's manipulation usually works by finding someone's emotional vulnerabilities and exploiting them. But Gus doesn't show emotional vulnerability. That doesn't mean he doesn't have emotions. His hatred for Hector and his love for Max drive a lot of his actions, but Gus keeps those emotions locked down tight and doesn't let them be used against him. Also, Gus has seen every trick Walt tries to pull before. Walt's not the first smart criminal Gus has dealt with. Gus has been navigating the drug trade and the cartel for years. Walt's manipulations are probably amateur hour compared to what Gus has experienced. The only reason Walt eventually beats Gus is through pure desperate improvisation and being willing to use a disabled old man as a suicide bomber. Walt doesn't manipulate Gus into his downfall. He just finds a crazy enough plan that Gus doesn't see coming. So no, Walt couldn't manipulate Gus. Gus is too experienced, too disciplined, and too smart to fall for Walt's psychological games. Lalo Salamanca. No, Walt couldn't manipulate him. Lalo is another hard no, and honestly, if Walt ever had to deal with Lalo directly, Walt would probably be dead pretty quickly. Lalo is charismatic and friendly on the surface, but underneath that charm, he's incredibly dangerous and perceptive. Lalo can read people instantly. He knows when someone's lying, when someone's scared, when someone's trying to play him. Walt's usual manipulation tactics involve building trust over time, playing on emotions, creating a dependence. None of that would work on Lalo because Lalo doesn't trust people in that way. Lalo is friendly with everyone but actually trusts basically no one. Lalo also operates on instinct and observation rather than logic and emotion. Walt's good at constructing logical arguments for why people should do what he wants or appealing to emotional needs. But Lalo makes decisions based on what his gut tells him about people, and Lalo's gut is usually right. If Walt tried to manipulate Lalo the way he manipulates Jesse, through emotional manipulation and playing on insecurities, Lalo would see through it immediately and probably find it amusing, then he'd kill Walt, or at least make it very clear that Walt needs to stop trying to be clever. The other problem is, Lalo is genuinely smarter than Walt in a lot of practical ways. Walt's got academic intelligence and strategic thinking, but Lalo's got street smarts and survival instincts that come from growing up in the cartel. Lalo can outthink Walt in the moment-to-moment interactions. Plus, Lalo doesn't need Walt for anything. Walt's manipulation usually works when he can make himself valuable to someone. With Jesse, Walt's the chemistry teacher and father figure. With Saul, Walt's is the big client who keeps Saul employed. But what would Lalo need from Walt? Lalo's connected to the cartel, he's got resources, he's got his own operations. Walt would just be some random guy trying to get in Lalo's good graces, and Lalo would have no reason to play along. So no, Walt couldn't manipulate Lalo, and honestly, a direct confrontation between Walt and Lalo would end with Walt dead pretty quickly. Lalo's just operating on a different level, Nacho Varga. Yes, Walt could manipulate him. Nacho is someone Walt could definitely manipulate, though it might not be as easy as manipulating Jesse. Nacho's weakness is his father. Everything Nacho does is motivated by protecting his dad from the cartel. Nacho's trying to keep his father's business legitimate and keep his father out of the criminal world. While Nacho himself is trapped in that world, Walt would figure this out pretty quickly because Walt's good at identifying what people care about most. And once Walt knows Nacho's vulnerable point is his father, Walt would use that ruthlessly. Walt would position himself as someone who can help protect Nacho's father. He'd offer solutions, create situations where Nacho feels indebted to him, make promises about keeping Nacho's father safe. And Nacho, desperate to protect his dad, would probably go along with it, even if he suspected Walt was manipulating him. The thing about Nacho is, he's smart and he's capable, but he's also kind of trapped by his circumstances and his love for his father that makes him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can exploit that pressure point. Walt's also good at creating artificial loyalty through shared experiences. He'd probably engineer some situation where he and Nacho go through something dangerous together, creating this false sense of partnership and trust. Walt does this with Jesse all the time. Nacho might see through some of Walt's tactics because Nacho's experienced in the criminal world and he's dealt with manipulative people before, but ultimately, Nacho's devotion to his father would override his better judgment, just like it does when he's working for Gus and the Salamancas. So yeah, Walt could manipulate Nacho, not as easily as he manipulates Jesse, but by focusing on Nacho's father as the leverage point, Walt would find his way in Chuck McGill. Yes, Walt could manipulate him. Chuck is someone Walt could absolutely manipulate, and it would almost be too easy. Chuck's got this massive ego wrapped up in being intellectually superior and morally righteous. He's convinced he's smarter than everyone around him, especially his brother Jimmy. And he's got this rigid view of how the world should work, where people like him who follow the rules should succeed, and people like Jimmy who cut corners should fail. Walt would approach Chuck by appealing to that sense of intellectual superiority and moral righteousness. Walt would position himself as a fellow man of principle, someone who understands the importance of rules and proper procedure. He'd probably bond with Chuck over being underestimated and underappreciated despite their intelligence. Walt's really good at mirroring people's self-image back to them. With Jesse, Walt plays the father figure. With Skylar, Walt plays the provider and protector. With Chuck, Walt would play the fellow intellectual who's been wronged by lesser minds. Chuck would eat this up because Chuck desperately wants to be validated by people he sees as his intellectual equals. And Walt's got legitimate scientific credentials. He contributed to Nobel Prize-winning research Chuck would respect that in a way he could never respect Jimmy's street smarts. The other thing is Chuck's blind spot is his own ego. He's so convinced of his own moral and intellectual superiority that he doesn't see when people are playing him. Jimmy manipulates Chuck pretty effectively throughout Better Call Saul by pushing Chuck's buttons around the respect and legitimacy. Walt would do the same thing, but more subtly, Walt would also exploit Chuck's resentment. Chuck resents Jimmy for being naturally charismatic and well-liked, despite being ethically flexible. Walt could bond with Chuck over that resentment, positioning himself as someone who also has to deal with less intelligent people getting ahead through charm rather than merit. The beautiful irony is that Chuck and Walt are actually pretty similar, both incredibly intelligent, both driven by ego and resentment, both convinced they're morally justified in their actions, but Chuck sees himself as principled, while Walt admits he's doing bad things. Walt would play on their similarities while hiding their differences, so yeah, Walt could manipulate Chuck easily. Chuck's too arrogant to see it coming and too resentful to resist someone who validates his worldview. Hector Salamanca. No, Walt couldn't manipulate him. Hector is a no, and honestly, this is one of the most interesting ones because Walt does kind of manipulate Hector in Breaking Bad, but only because of very specific circumstances. Hector, as we see him in Better Call Saul before the stroke, is sharp and dangerous and absolutely not someone Walt could manipulate. Hector's been in the cartel for decades, he's survived multiple wars, dealt with countless threats, and he's got this animal instinct for danger and deception. Pre-stroke. Hector would see through Walt immediately. Hector doesn't respond to intellectual arguments or emotional appeals. He respects strength, fear, and results. Walt couldn't offer any of those things in a way that would impress Hector. Plus, Hector is deeply loyal to the cartel and the Salamanca family. Walt's manipulations usually work by creating new loyalties or exploiting existing ones, but Hector's loyalty to his family and the cartel is so strong that Walt couldn't wedge his way in there. Now, in Breaking Bad, Walt does use Hector to kill Gus, but that only works because Hector is disabled and consumed by hatred for Gus. Walt's not really manipulating Hector so much as offering him an opportunity for revenge. Hector makes his own choice to be the suicide bomber because he wants Gus dead more than he wants to keep living. If Hector was still healthy and sharp, Walt's attempt to recruit him against Gus would have gotten Walt killed. Hector would immediately or just killed Walt himself for the disrespect of even suggesting it. So no, Walt couldn't manipulate Hector, especially not pre-stroke Hector. The only reason Walt's plan works in Breaking Bad is because Hector's circumstances make him willing to die for revenge, and that's not manipulation, that's just giving someone what they already wanted. So if you look at who Walt can and can't manipulate, there's a clear pattern. Walt can manipulate people who have emotional vulnerabilities that they're not fully aware of or can't fully control. Jimmy wants respect and legitimacy. Kim wants to help people. Nacho wants to protect his father. Chuck wants validation of his superiority. All of these are emotional needs that Walt could identify and exploit. But the people Walt can't manipulate, Gus, Lalo, Hector, they're either emotionally disciplined to the point where they don't show vulnerability, or they operate on instinct and street smarts that Walt can't match, or they simply don't need anything from Walt. What's interesting is that most of the Better Call Saul characters are actually more experienced criminals than Walt ever becomes. Jimmy's been running cons since childhood. Nacho's been in the drug trade for years. Gus, Lalo, and Hector are cartel veterans with decades of experience. Walt's manipulation skills work great on civilians and on people newer to the criminal world like Jesse. But against experienced criminals who've seen every trick, Walt's success rate drops dramatically. This makes sense when you think about it. Walt's only in the meth business for like 2 years total. He's playing catch-up the entire time, learning the rules as he goes. The Better Call Saul characters have been in this world way longer, and they've learned to protect themselves against manipulation because that's basic survival in their world. The people Walt could manipulate from Better Call Saul are either not fully in the criminal world yet, like early Jimmy or Kim, or they've got such glaring emotional vulnerabilities, like Nacho with his father, that even an amateur manipulator could exploit them. But the true professionals like Gus and Lalo, they'd eat Walt alive. Walt only survives his encounters with Gus through desperate improvisation and luck, not through superior manipulation. And if Walt ever had to directly deal with Lalo, the show would have ended real quick with Walt's body in a ditch somewhere. Let me know in the comments if you think I got any of these wrong. I know some people might argue Walt could manipulate Gus, or that he couldn't manipulate Kim. These characters are complex and there's definitely room for different interpretations. The fun part about these hypotheticals is imagining how these different personalities would interact and who would come out on top in a battle of wits.